My father-in-law's funeral had barely ended when my husband told me I should start packing. He stood there in the very house I had helped his father keep in order through the last 2 years of his life, then said, in a calm voice, that my work here was done. I did not cry right then. I simply looked at the man I had been married to for 7 years and understood that some marriages do not break on the day love runs out. They break on the day one person decides to erase the other person's labor with a single sentence. He thought I would walk out of that house like an outsider. He thought the funeral being over meant it was finally time for him to take everything back. But the next morning, at his father's lawyer's office, the very first name read in the will was mine. My name is Nora. I am 36 years old, and I work as an operations manager for a rehabilitation center in Virginia. My job is to keep messy things running: appointments, staffing, bills, supplies, and the small disruptions that can collapse an entire day. Perhaps that is why, when Arthur, my father-in-law, began to deteriorate 2 years ago, everything naturally began to flow towards me. I became the one who scheduled his appointments, changed his medications, remembered his blood pressure times, called the nurses, and cut the salt from his dinner. I was also the one who wiped up the coffee he spilled, changed his shirt when his hands shook, and sat there listening to the same old story while still nodding in the right places. I was simply the person who was present the most and left the latest. I married Matthew 7 years ago. In the beginning, I thought I had married a decent man. He spoke just enough, dressed neatly, and knew how to use the right tone with the right person. Matthew is very good at appearing where he needs to be seen. It took me years to name the coldness in him correctly. Matthew is not explosive. He does not throw things. He does not yell. He just does less the moment the work turns heavy, then steps in right at the end to collect the cleanest version of the image. Arthur was never the sweet kind of father-in-law. He had been a widower for years. His voice was rough, he spoke little, and he was used to giving orders. He did not ask whether other people were tired. He did not have the habit of thanking for every small thing. In the first months after I married into the family, Arthur treated me with a kind of dry politeness so restrained it was almost cold. But after living around him long enough, I realized Arthur was not bad. He simply kept everything at a hard distance. Over time, something very quiet formed between us. He saw that whatever I did it properly. I did not flatter. I didn't sweet-talk. I brought his medicine on time, even when he was sharp with me. I called the doctor back when a prescription made him dizzy. Arthur noticed those things. He just never said them in a soft way. Matthew did not exactly abandon his father. He still showed up. He still signed papers when needed. He still took Arthur out to dinner on nights when other people were around. But the real care always fell to me. The real exhaustion, the repetition, the mess of old age. The nights Arthur lost control of his bladder, the mornings he snapped because he could not find his glasses. Sometimes his memory blurred, and he called out the name of someone who had been dead for 10 years. Matthew was never there for those parts. He always had something important happening at exactly the hardest moment. Or he came back after everything had already been cleaned up. I saw that very early. Still, I made excuses for him too many times. Maybe men handle their parents' illness worse. Maybe he was afraid of seeing his father weaken. Maybe his work really could not be moved. What started to bother me was not only that Matthew started putting less effort into his own father. It was that he talked about the future too much while Arthur was still alive. Later on, we should probably sell this house. Later on, his accounts should be consolidated to keep things neat. He used the phrase later on like a man who already had the keys in his hand. At first, I thought that was just the way men talked about practical matters. But as Arthur got closer to the end, Matthew's questions became sharper, and they were not the questions of a son who hurt because his father was getting weaker. Where was the deed? Which accounts were still in Arthur's sole name? Which drawer held the insurance documents? One time he leaned against the kitchen counter, watched me organizing Arthur's medical records into a binder, and said, half joking, that if I kept all the paperwork like that, outsiders might start thinking the house belonged to me. I looked up at my husband. He smiled right after, as if he had said something harmless. But jokes like that do not grow out of nowhere. Arthur became visibly weaker in the last 6 months. There were days when he was lucid enough to remember old property tax figures. There were days when he forgot whether he had eaten lunch. Yet during that uneven stretch, I noticed him watching Matthew more closely than ever. Each time his son entered the room and started talking about papers, Arthur's eyes changed immediately. He spoke less. He argued less. He just watched. One time, right after Matthew left, Arthur sat by the window for a long while, then told me to pull my chair closer. He spoke slowly, each word laid down as if it mattered. Do not let anyone make you think your labor disappears just because they speak louder. I remember freezing. Not because I fully understood him then, but because Arthur never said things like that unless he had been noticing something for a long time. In the final weeks before he died, the whole house moved around a rhythm only the people living inside it could understand. The smell of medicine, the smell of oatmeal, the sound of the breathing monitor. The yellow lamp turned low every night. I slept in broken pieces on the long chair outside his room for 3 nights straight before things turned truly bad. Matthew was around more often then, but in a strange way. He would go into the room, ask the doctor a few questions, stay long enough for anyone looking to notice, then step into the hallway to take a phone call. One night, just after midnight, I opened the kitchen door and found him digging through the drawer where Arthur kept important papers. Matthew said he was only looking for the insurance folder, but when I handed him the exact folder, he still stood there for a few more seconds in front of that open drawer, like someone disappointed he had not found the thing he actually wanted. Arthur died on a Monday morning. He passed more quietly than I had expected, after a night of short breaths and hands that turned cold very quickly. I was the one standing beside his bed when the doctor confirmed the time of death. Matthew was there too, though half a step back, as if even in that moment he still wanted to keep enough distance not to touch the most real part of dying. After that, everything rushed forward. The funeral home, the phone calls, the flowers, the guest list, the church, black clothes, finger food for the visitors. I ran through those 2 days like a person trying to keep a wheel from slipping off its axle. By the time the casket was closed, I still had not had time to sit down and feel who I had lost. The funeral unfolded in the polished, cold way old families with status know how to arrange. Matthew played the grieving son almost perfectly. He stood in the right spot, bowed his head at the right moments, hugged a few relatives with exactly the right amount of force. I looked at my husband in the cemetery, his hand resting on a bouquet of white flowers, his eyes just red enough, and all I felt inside was exhaustion. Not because I did not hurt. I had simply been too busy for too long to grieve in any normal way. When the last car pulled away from the cemetery, I thought the worst part of the day was behind us. I was wrong. The worst thing did not happen in the church. It did not happen beside the grave. It happened in Arthur's kitchen, where I had stood hundreds of times making soup, sorting pills, drying glasses, and holding together the rhythm of life for an old, failing man. That night, after the last guest left, I went into the kitchen to wash the white lily vase that had already begun to sag. The sleeves of my black dress still carried the smell of the funeral parlor. Matthew walked in, did not sit down, did not ask if I had eaten, and said flatly that I should start packing in the next few days. He stayed leaning against the doorway, his voice flat as a tabletop. This house is a family business now. It no longer made sense for me to stay. I asked him what he had just said. Matthew exhaled like I was the one making everything more difficult. He said Arthur was gone. Things had to be sorted clearly now. He told me not to make it into a scene, that there would be lawyers, paperwork, and relatives, and everybody needed to be where they belonged. I looked at the man I had been married to for 7 years, the man who had stood at his father's funeral looking like a grieving son, and heard him talk to me in the voice of a broker about the house where I had carried his father almost alone for 2 years. I did not cry. I did not yell. Some shocks do not shatter you right away. They turn you cold first. Matthew added a few more lines I still remember exactly. He said, "I understood this was his family's asset. People would start coming in and out now. My being there would make things awkward." I asked awkwardly for whom. He answered, without looking at me, "For everyone." That was the moment I understood something deeper. In my husband's mind, I was no longer his wife. I was an element that needed to be cleared from the scene so everything would look cleaner. A leftover part of the funeral, something to be moved back into its correct square before other people arrived to read names on the property. The pain was not really about being thrown out of a house. If that were all it had been, I could have called it simple misfortune. The real pain was that all those years I carried his father and the house itself could be erased by Matthew with a few sentences in the kitchen. I changed Arthur's clothes when he could not do it alone. I sat beside him in the emergency room while Matthew was tied up somewhere else. I remembered medication times, test times, and follow-up appointments. I kept that house from becoming a cold place where a man simply waited to die. Yet in my husband's eyes, none of it gave me even the smallest right to stay. It was work that had been completed, and once the work was done, the worker should go. From that moment on, I knew the marriage had changed shape. I stood there for a long time after Matthew finished speaking. The water in the sink had gone cold. The glass vase slid slightly in my hand because of the soap. Outside, the wind pushed the ribbons on a funeral wreath against the glass with a soft tapping sound. Matthew left the kitchen first. He went upstairs without looking back at me once. I remained there under the low yellow kitchen light and realized that the scariest thing in the house was not the death that had just happened. The scariest thing was how quickly the living can brush away another person's labor when they think they are about to touch the inheritance. I do not know how long I stood still in that kitchen. Matthew mistook my silence for understanding. His tone even softened a little, like he was being generous. He told me to take a few days and make it orderly, as if he were granting me something. I looked at my husband's face and suddenly saw something I had only been sensing dimly for months. He was not grieving his father through pain. He was grieving through urgency. Urgency to move to the next stage. Urgency to change the status of the house. Urgency to make me understand my position on the very first night, before anyone else could step between him and the thing he believed was now his. I dried my hands on the towel by the sink, set it down, and asked one question. He had been thinking about this before his father died. Matthew did not answer immediately. He looked away for one brief beat and told me not to make everything so emotional. That tiny hesitation was my answer. He had not decided to throw me out that night. He had simply been waiting for the right moment to say it. Waiting for the funeral to end. Waiting for the guests to leave. Waiting until the house had no witnesses left except me. I didn't answer after that. I just stood there and realized the clearest thing of all. In Matthew's eyes, I had never been real family. I was the person who kept the schedule, kept the medicine, and kept the rhythm of the house while it still needed support. Once Arthur was down, Matthew changed the way he looked at me. No more labor, no more nights awake, no more wait from those final 2 years, just a door, a house, and a man eager to shut that door in my face. I went upstairs very late that night, but I did not sleep. I sat on the edge of the bed, looking at the old suitcase in the closet, and the room felt strange, as if it had never really belonged to me. Not because anything had changed physically, because I was finally seeing it through the same eyes Matthew had probably been using for years. A temporary room, a temporary person, labor with an expiration date. The pain was not only being pushed out, the pain was realizing my husband truly believed that once his father died, my purpose in that house died with him, as if all the years I had poured into it had never gathered any weight at all. That night, I did not cry much. I just felt hollow and cold inside. I remembered Arthur lying in bed during those final weeks, the veins standing out on his hands, his voice weak, but his eyes still sharp on rare good days. I remembered what he had told me about not letting anyone make me believe my work disappeared just because they were louder. I had not fully understood then. On the night of the funeral, With my husband standing in that cold kitchen telling me my role there was over, I finally understood that Arthur had not spoken carelessly. He had seen something before I had. My father-in-law had been buried only a few hours, and my husband was already looking at me like a service item that had run out of use. The next morning, I woke before my alarm because of the sound of a wooden drawer being yanked too hard at the far end of the hall. The house still smelled like white flowers and room spray from the night before. The black dress I had draped over the chair was still there. Arthur's photograph still sat on the side table in the living room beside a half-burnt candle. Everything in the house still carried the atmosphere of a recent death. Only Matthew was different. He was not moving like a son who had buried his father the day before. He was moving like a man who had just been handed a key. When I stepped out of the bedroom, Matthew was inside Arthur's old study. The paper safe was standing open. The 2 lower drawers had already been pulled all the way out. 3 file binders sat off to the side as if they were waiting for review. He did not look up when he saw me. He only said he needed to get things organized before too many people started putting their hands in. I stood in the doorway, looking at my husband bent over his father's papers, not even 12 hours after the funeral, and understood that what he had said the night before had not been a burst of grief. It was the first spoken piece of an idea already settled in his mind before Arthur ever closed his eyes. The first thing Matthew did that morning sent a chill straight through me. He began moving every file I had been organizing for over a year. Arthur's appointment history, medicine invoices, bank letters, insurance papers, and the documents tied to the house. I had always kept them in the same place because some weeks Arthur had to go to the hospital twice. One missing page could throw everything into confusion. Matthew knew that. He still pulled each folder out, restacked them in his own order, then tossed me one quiet sentence. I did not need to hold on to all of that anymore. From now on, he would handle it. The way he said "from now on" felt colder than the tone itself. It sounded like I had just been removed from a machine while still standing inside it. Not by shouting, by replacement. I asked him what exactly he planned to handle when his father had been dead for less than a day. Matthew still did not look at me. He said there was plenty to do after a funeral. House papers, accounts, taxes, things belonging to his family. I heard the phrase, "his family," clearly. It was not the first time. That morning, though, it had the sharpness of a thin blade. He moved through the house all morning like a new owner. He opened Arthur's liquor cabinet and counted bottles. Opened the kitchen drawer where I kept the payment book for the night aid. Called someone I assumed was a real estate broker because I caught the word appraisal. After that, he called a financial advisor who had worked with Arthur in the past. His voice dropped just enough that outsiders would have heard a responsible son handling his father's aftermath. I was inside the house. I could hear the real rhythm beneath it. It was not grief. It was haste. What unsettled me even more was the way Matthew's language changed almost immediately. By that morning, he had started saying, "my father," "my family's property," "my house," and "my father's lawyer." Every sentence pulled inward toward him as if I had not spent the last 2 years taking Arthur to appointments, tracking his medication, changing his sheets when he woke in night sweats, and wiping down the kitchen after he spilled soup with shaking hands. Matthew did not need to say directly that I was an outsider. He only had to move me out of the grimy. Sometimes in marriage, you are not pushed out of a place through open violence. You are pushed out by the way the other person begins behaving as if your presence were only a mistake waiting to be corrected. I saw that very clearly in each small thing Matthew did that morning. The coffee cup was left directly on the table. Arthur hated anyone using it that way. The way he took Arthur's car keys from the wooden tray by the door and slipped them into his own pocket. The way he told the gardener to deal with him next week instead of asking me as usual. Each thing was just one fragment. Put together, they drew the map of power. Standing in that kitchen, I found myself remembering Arthur's last months more vividly than ever. He was not easy to like. He could be particular about everything, from how a napkin was folded to where a magazine was set down. He hated sloppiness. He hated people who talked in circles. He hated being pitied. On the better days, he still pushed himself to come downstairs for breakfast on time and wore a button-down shirt even if he was never leaving the house. But the final stretch changed him. His short-term memory could be terrible on some days. He called the doctor by the wrong name once or twice. There were afternoons when he asked the same question 3 times. Then there were others when his mind was so sharp it felt like his eyes could cut paper. On those sharp days, Arthur started saying things to me that sounded stranger than anything he had said before. One time, while I was helping him reorganize the medicine drawer, he told me to take a brown envelope from the lowest compartment and put it somewhere else. I asked where. He said something I would remember clearly. He told me not to let Matthew touch it before the right time. I looked at him because I thought I had misheard him. Arthur did not explain. He only said that when people grow weaker, they start seeing who is becoming impatient. At the time, I thought he was just in a foul mood after arguing with his son that afternoon. Standing in that house after the funeral, I started to believe he may have seen much more than I knew. Another time, after I drove Arthur back from a heart appointment, he stayed in the passenger seat much longer than necessary before getting out. He stared at the front yard and said, in that dry old voice, that if something happened, I was not to sign anything, not to move out, not to do anything simply because someone else raised their voice. I asked who he was talking about. Arthur said the men in that family often mistook volume for authority. At the time, I only went quiet. I did not think further because he was tired, and I still had to get him inside and settled with his medicine. But by the morning after the funeral, every word came back with perfect timing. Arthur had also changed lawyers about 8 months before he died. I remembered that clearly because Matthew had become furious at the dinner table. The family had used the same law office for nearly 20 years. Then one day, Arthur announced he was no longer working with them. He switched to a different lawyer downtown, younger and quieter, and only met with him by private appointment. Matthew asked why. Arthur answered simply that he wanted to. Matthew laughed coldly and said that if his father was changing lawyers just to prove he still controlled everything, that was a very expensive way of doing it. Arthur put down his fork, looked at his son for a long moment, and said, "Trust costs more." The air at that table had thickened instantly. I asked what he meant by practical. Matthew said his father was dead. My role in the house was different now. I stood still for a few seconds because I genuinely wanted to be certain I had heard the word correctly. Role. He had just called 2 years of medicine schedules, sheet changes, wheelchair handling, soup making, and sleepless nights through Arthur's breathing episodes a role. Something that could expire as soon as the sick person died. That sentence did not blow me apart. It made me turn cold, because I understood my husband had not misspoken. He had believed this for a long time. Now he just no longer needed to preserve appearances. Later, I went upstairs to Arthur's room to retrieve a handkerchief I had left there the night before. The room still smelled of joint cream and old wood. The water glass on the nightstand was still half full. His reading glasses still rested on the black notebook beside the lamp. Looking at that room brought back another memory. About 3 weeks before he died, Arthur had told me to open the bottom drawer of his nightstand and take out a small key wrapped in tissue. He told me to move it somewhere else because it was no longer safe there. I asked what it opened. Arthur said I did not need to know yet. I only needed to remember that he had given it to me. Then he lay there quietly for a long time, before adding a sentence that had sounded very odd to me then. When the time came, he said, I was not to let my own decency be used to push me out the door. I sat down in the chair beside his bed and watched the curtain move. If everything really was as certain as Matthew believed, then why had Arthur told me to wait for the lawyer? Why had he changed lawyers right when his health began to worsen more visibly? Why had he repeatedly told me to set aside papers, keys, and envelopes? I am not the type of person who likes inventing drama out of grief. That afternoon, for the first time, I felt that I should not walk away just because my husband happened to speak louder. Arthur might have seen something before I did. If he had seen it, then maybe he had done something too. Late that afternoon, my phone buzzed while I was changing the water in the white floral arrangement in the living room. Unknown number. I answered in the tired voice of someone who had buried a family member the day before. It was the assistant from Arthur's new lawyer's office. She asked if I was Nora, then said very clearly that the office needed me present for the will reading on Monday morning. I told her I understood and that I would come with my husband. She paused, then corrected me. No, ma'am. I was requested to be there as someone Arthur had named directly. I stood in the middle of the living room, still holding the cloth I had used to wipe the vase, and felt my heart start pounding into my throat. I asked her to repeat herself because I thought I had misunderstood. She said it again, exactly. Named directly, not alongside Matthew, not as some vague family member. Directly. I thanked her and hung up. When I looked up, Matthew was standing in the kitchen doorway. He had heard enough to ask, in a voice that sounded almost too normal, who it had been. I told him Arthur's law office had called and wanted both of us there Monday morning. Matthew nodded. Then I added one more line. They had said I had been named directly. I saw that moment pass over his face. It lasted only a beat. Such a small beat. You would miss it if you had not lived beside him for years. His blink slowed. His jaw tightened, then released. After that, he smiled and said it was probably only a procedure. Lawyers liked making things sound more serious than they really were. He turned away too quickly after saying it, and I had already seen enough. For the first time since the night before, his certainty had cracked. Matthew tried to recover his old rhythm by staying busy. He made more calls, opened the liquor cabinet, walked back and forth between the kitchen and Arthur's office with the air of a man handling mountains of important business. By then, though, I could see the imbalance in every movement. A man who truly has everything secure does not need that much activity to keep himself upright. Matthew was trying to make himself feel that he still controlled the house, the room, the assets, and the story. As long as I was there, watching that small fracture, I knew I could not leave simply because he wanted me gone. That night we ate in near silence. The sound of a knife touching a plate carried sharply in the kitchen that had so recently been full of reminders about Arthur's medication times. Every so often, Matthew would toss out a question with no clear beginning or end, as if he were testing the ground under him. Had the lawyers said anything else? Had they mentioned any specific documents? Had Arthur ever said anything to me before he died? I answered just enough. Not too much. Not too little. My steadiness seemed to bother him even more. I watched my husband across from me, chewing slowly, his eyes coming back to me in intervals, and saw his unease starting to creep up under the surface of his composure. When the dishes were done, I went upstairs and locked the bedroom door behind me for the first time in years. Not because I thought Matthew would do anything drastic that night. I just needed one space where I could hear nothing but my own breathing. No voice, no footsteps moving through the house like an occupation. I sat on the edge of the bed, opened the drawer beside me, and took out the little tissue-wrapped bundle holding the key Arthur had given me. It was still there. Small, cold, light enough to look like nothing at all. I held it in my hand for a very long time. Not because I already knew what it opened, because for the first time I started to think that the man who had died the day before had not left everything to chance. That night I still did not know what Arthur had left behind. But I knew one thing. The man who had just tried to force me out of the house was no longer as steady as he had been the night before. Right after the funeral, I understood that I was not yet allowed to walk away. On Monday morning, I drove to Arthur's lawyer's office nearly 20 minutes early. The building sat on a quiet corner with a dark glass front, its sign so small you could miss it walking by. I stayed in the car for a while before getting out. 2 days earlier, I had been standing at the cemetery in black, listening to dirt fall over my father-in-law's casket. That same night, Matthew told me I should prepare to leave the house. That morning, I had to walk into a room where my name would be spoken in a way neither he nor I had fully imagined. I adjusted my collar, turned off the engine, and went inside. The lobby was quiet. The smell of polished wood and weak coffee hung in the air. A young receptionist led me down the hallway into the conference room. It was not large. A long walnut table. Blinds half drawn. Water, tissues, and a dark blue file are already placed in order. Matthew had arrived before me. He sat leaning slightly forward, hands resting on his knees, wearing that calm face he uses when he wants people to believe he is in control. Denise, Arthur's cousin, sat to his right. At the head of the table sat a financial advisor I recognized from Arthur's old records. Matthew looked up when I entered. "You're early," he said. I pulled out my chair and told him I did not want to be late for anything connected to Arthur. He nodded, but there was something in his eyes that had lost its smoothness from the night before. The lawyer entered exactly on time. He was somewhere in his 50s, lean, his hair combed close, his voice dry and even. I had met him once at Arthur's house. That morning, he set down his case, took the middle seat, opened the file, and looked at each of us before he began. No useless pleasantries. He simply thanked everyone for coming, confirmed identities, and reminded us that the full reading would be recorded in the minutes. The first few minutes passed exactly the way I had expected. A few small donations to the local library fund, a contribution to the cardiology department of the hospital where Arthur had been treated during his last 2 years. The watch collection was divided between 2 nephews from his late wife's side. A cash amount was placed into a college fund for Denise's son. Everything sounded orderly, exactly like an old-school wealthy man arranging his affairs. Matthew sat very still through all of it. When I looked over, I could see him loosening with every passing item. By the time the lawyer reached the smaller details, the corner of his mouth had almost begun to move. Each time the lawyer turned a new page, I felt my heart jump once more. All I wanted to know was what Arthur had seen, and why he had insisted on dragging my name into this so directly. After the donations, the lawyer paused for a sip of water. He looked down at the file a little longer than before. The room was so quiet I could hear the ventilation overhead. Then he said we were moving into the section concerning residential rights, home maintenance funds, and specific instructions effective immediately after Arthur's death. Matthew straightened. Denise placed her glass down onto its coaster. I kept my hands where they were in my lap. The lawyer read my name first. He spoke clearly, every word distinct. According to the will and addendum signed on April 14th, Nora was to be granted exclusive residence rights to the property at 82 Hawthorne Street for a period of 7 years from the date of Arthur's death, or until she voluntarily surrendered those rights by notarized written agreement. I did not understand the full sentence in the first 2 seconds. The word exclusive moved more slowly through my mind than the rest. I turned toward the lawyer, then toward Matthew at nearly the same moment. His face did not go red first. It went pale. The lawyer continued as if nothing had exploded in the room. During that period, no other individual, including Matthew, had the right to force Nora out of the home, interfere with her use of the primary living spaces, or initiate the sale, restructuring, long-term leasing, or mortgaging of the property unless all conditions listed later had first been met. I heard the soft scrape of Matthew's chair on the floor. Before I could recover, the lawyer turned the page again. In addition to residential rights, Nora was appointed primary overseer of the Home Maintenance Fund, including taxes, necessary repairs, insurance, and the preservation of private documents and personal effects belonging solely to Arthur. Nora would also retain the original medical records, private letters, and personal papers Arthur had separated before his death. Finally, there was a sealed envelope to be opened publicly during the reading, and that envelope was to be handed directly to Nora. That was the moment my hands truly turned cold. Arthur had left behind something he wanted the entire room to witness when it was opened. The lawyer pulled a thick ivory envelope from the file. Only one handwritten line ran across the front. "For Nora. Read here." Matthew spoke for the first time since my name had been read. Too quickly. He said he thought the matter should be reviewed. Maybe his father had only wanted me to stay temporarily through the first stage. The lawyer did not even look at him right away. He said he would read the full conditions before responding to any objections. That answer thickened the air. I opened the envelope with my fingertips. Inside were 3 handwritten pages and 1 shorter typed sheet. I looked at the lawyer. He nodded and said I could read them aloud myself, or he could do it if I preferred. I told him to read. He began. Nora, if you are sitting there listening to this, then I was right about two things. First, Matthew would move too quickly after I died. Second, you would be put in the position of having to defend your labor before you had even had time to mourn me properly. I sat completely still. Denise lowered her eyes. Matthew turned fully toward the lawyer as if he could stop the words by staring hard enough. Arthur's letter went on. He wrote that he was not a man who knew how to say thank you directly. And that was his failure. He apologized for leaving too much of the hardest part of his last 2 years on me, when that burden should have been carried by his son. He wrote that my presence had kept the house standing longer than outsiders would ever understand. Arthur did not sound sentimental. He still wrote in his usual dry, direct way. He said Matthew had always believed power belonged to whoever spoke the loudest or carried the family name. He said that was the most dangerous misunderstanding among the men in that family. And if that misunderstanding kept going after his death, he was not going to let it move forward without barriers. The lawyer set the handwritten pages down and picked up the typed sheet. He said this was the section with immediate legal force. He read that Matthew had no right to force Nora to leave the house before the residential term ended. He had no authority to unilaterally list the property, mortgage it, or alter the maintenance trust structure. He was prohibited from using written pressure, verbal pressure, or direct action intended to force Nora to surrender the rights described above. If any such action were established, the principal share of Matthew's inheritance connected to Arthur's investments and long-term disbursement assets would automatically be transferred into a supervised trust for 10 years. Matthew's direct access would then be suspended. Hearing that, I had the strange sensation that Arthur was still somewhere inside that old house, looking at his son and saying exactly what he meant. This was not a gift for me. It was a legal trap placed in the right spot, for the right person, aimed at the right flaw. Matthew shot to his feet before the lawyer finished the addendum. He said the whole thing was absurd. He said his father had not been mentally sound at the end, no matter what people in the room wanted to pretend. Denise immediately looked at him. The financial advisor frowned. I stayed where I was, because in that exact second, I knew Matthew had made the mistake Arthur had prepared for. The lawyer did not look surprised. He closed the file, opened the black case beside him, and took out a thicker stack of documents. If Matthew wished to challenge Arthur's legal capacity at the time these documents were signed, the office had already prepared the entire supporting record. Then he placed a small drive on the table, along with notarized papers and 2 medical statements. He explained that every major addendum had been signed on days Arthur had been assessed by a physician as fully competent. The signing had taken place at the law office, before a notary, with video recording and independent written confirmation. The video was played on the wall screen. Arthur sat upright in a chair, wearing a gray blazer and reading glasses, his voice still measured and clear. He stated his own name, confirmed the date, answered a series of questions about his assets, his chosen beneficiaries, the reason for changing lawyers, and the reason for separating out residential rights for me. At one point, Arthur said flatly that he did not want Nora's care to be erased simply because his son believed bloodline allowed him to move faster than conscience. When the video ended, the lawyer placed 2 medical certifications on the table. One was a cognitive assessment from 3 days before the signing. The other confirmed that on the day itself, Arthur was properly oriented, answering logically, and fully aware of the legal consequences of his decisions. Last came the notarized record with signatures, seals, and timestamps. Arthur had locked the counterstrike down tightly. He had left no room for emotion to outrun paperwork. Matthew sat down more slowly than he had risen. The anger on his face had not disappeared, but it no longer looked firm. Something else had mixed into it. Denise kept her eyes away from him. The financial advisor cleared his throat once and said nothing. I stayed seated, my hands resting on the table edge, the open envelope in front of me. The will reading went on for nearly 20 more minutes with other detailed clauses, but I remember none of them as vividly as Matthew's face when the lawyer finished. He had walked into that room like a man about to be handed the keys to his life. He had sat like someone already wearing victory. By the time he stood, his face no longer belonged to the air. It belonged to a man who had just realized his father had measured him correctly before he died. My husband entered the will reading like a man about to receive the keys. He walked out of it with the face of someone who had just learned his father had known exactly who he was before death ever arrived. That evening, after we left the lawyer's office, Matthew waited for me at the stone steps outside the building. He did not come too close. He did not grab my arm. He did not raise his voice. He just stood there, wearing the last shape of a civilized man, trying to hold himself together. When I passed him, he said we needed to talk. I stopped, not because I still wanted to hear him, but because I wanted to know which mask my husband would choose next after that conference room collapse. Matthew said we could handle everything privately. He said it in a very even voice, as if what had happened inside were only a paperwork misunderstanding that could be smoothed out if I chose to be reasonable. I asked him what privately was supposed to mean. Matthew said his father's lawyer liked making things more complicated than they needed to be. He said Arthur had been old, prone to extremes, physically weak, and easy to influence at the end. Then he lowered his voice. If I wanted to remain in the house for a while, he would not object. But I did not need to keep all those rights. The way he said all those rights told me everything I needed to know. In his mind, the residential rights, the maintenance fund, and the private files, none of them were his father's true final intention. There were obstacles between him and what he had already imagined in his hands. I asked him which rights he wanted me to surrender first. Matthew answered immediately, almost without needing to think. I could give up oversight of the fund, give up the private records. The house could still remain open to me for a while out of decency. I just should not turn this into something that dragged the whole family into a mess. I listened to all of it, then asked about the house. Matthew said it was his family's property, and sooner or later, it had to go back where it belonged. That sentence made me go quiet for a few seconds. After everything that had been read in that room, after the letter, after the video, after everything Arthur had said while alive, Matthew still saw only one path: back to himself. I did not drag the argument out. I did not want to give him the chance to turn the moment into a marital negotiation. I told him clearly that I would not sign anything. Everything would move exactly according to the documents Arthur had left. Matthew let out one short laugh. It was not amusement. It sounded like a reflex jerk from a man trying to conceal aggression he did not yet want to show. He asked if I was seriously going to stand on paperwork against my own husband. I told him I was standing exactly where his father had told me to stand. That darkened his face immediately. I could see it plainly. He was not only angry because he had lost control, he was angry because for the first time in years, I was no longer letting him name the situation for me. When we got home, Matthew still did not stop. He went straight into the kitchen, opened the cabinet, filled a glass, and stood there with his back to me. He said I did not understand how messy lawyers could make things. He said he was trying to save me from a long chain of ugly procedures. I had been taking off my coat when I stopped. I asked him who exactly he was saving. Matthew turned toward me quickly, as if he had not expected the question to come that directly. He answered that this was family business. I looked at him and said nothing, which was why I was not going to let him turn it into business for one man only. The kitchen went silent. The ice in his glass struck the side loudly. The next morning, the lawyer called while I was changing the flowers in the living room. He said Arthur had left another file behind. It was only to be opened if a dispute arose, if coercion began, or if there was any attempt to alter the terms too soon. My skin went cold. Arthur had not only anticipated Matthew's reaction, but also prepared for it. He had prepared for the possibility that the reaction would turn into action. I drove to the law office immediately. This time, there was none of the formal atmosphere from the will reading. The lawyer brought me into a smaller room. Only him and me. A sealed brown archive box sat on the table. He placed it between us and said quietly that Arthur had hoped it would never be needed, but he believed that if Matthew chose speed, I would need to know what I was actually facing. Inside the box, there was more than a letter. There were printed emails, handwritten notes, financial statements, meeting logs, A second envelope with Arthur's handwriting. Looking at that stack of paper, I felt something strange rise in a shock. It was no longer a shock. Not exactly pain either. It felt like standing in front of a door you do not want to open, while understanding that only opening it will make every scattered fragment line up. The lawyer handed me the first set. It was a chain of emails Matthew had sent Arthur over the final 6 months. The tone was nothing like the polished civility he kept in front of other people. In one email, he pushed Arthur to sign investment authorization papers quickly, arguing it would avoid problems later. In another, he wrote that Arthur's health was declining too fast, and it would be smarter to let someone still fully capable organize the assets before it was too late. One sentence made me read it twice. The longer Arthur delayed, the bigger the mess Matthew would have to clean up later. I stared at that line. It was not the voice of a son thinking ahead. It was the voice of a man treating an undivided inheritance like an unfinished task that was slowing down his life. The next file contained Arthur's own short notes from a notebook. Date, time, 1 or 2 lines. Matthew asked about the house papers again after dinner. Matthew became angry when I refused to sign. Matthew said keeping too many files would create the wrong impression. On some pages, Arthur had added his own comments. He is not worried about me. He is worried about what he thinks is about to become his. I had never seen Arthur write about his son in a voice like that. Not because he hated him, exactly because he understood him too well. The disappointment came out that cold. Then, the lawyer turned to the section that took away any chance of comforting me with doubt. These were files tied to the family investment fund. Arthur had sold the company years earlier, but he kept a long-term distribution fund and several separate accounts. The papers showed clear traces that Matthew had tried to access the fund before he was authorized. He could not withdraw money because he lacked the right authority, but he had attempted to change a cosigner, tried to alter access instructions, tried to obtain greater control under the excuse of helping an aging father manage his affairs. Every request had been blocked or stopped by Arthur. The fact that they existed at all told me enough. Matthew had not waited for his father to die before he started looking at the money. He had been circling it for a very long time. The lawyer placed another file in front of me and said there was one more thing I needed to know. It concerned a failed real estate investment. Matthew's name was not prominent on the cover, but the attachments included a personal guarantee, debt notices, bank warnings, and a record of delayed payments. Matthew was financially trapped. Not the kind of shortfall someone could quietly manage within a few months. Something large enough to explain the urgency I had been seeing throughout Arthur's final weeks. Once I finished those pages, everything in my head linked on its own. The questions about the deed, the calls to brokers are too early. The way he moved around the house was like a man who needed to secure an asset before someone else touched it. Matthew's impatience was not only greed, it was also pressure. What hollowed me out was not the fact that my husband had debt. People make bad investments. People panic under pressure. People fear losing control over their future. What chilled me was his willingness to use his father's death to patch the collapse in his own life without slowing down for even a beat. Arthur had seen that early, not because he hated his son. There was no bitterness in those notes. I saw only a father who had reached the point where he no longer dared hand direct power to his own child. He knew Matthew would burn through the entire inheritance if doing so gave his own ego the illusion of being saved, so he refused to put the assets directly in his hands. In that moment, I also understood more clearly why Arthur had chosen me. Not because he loved me more than his own son in some sentimental way. Arthur was not soft in that way. He chose me because inside that house, I was the only person still behaving by principle. I did not push papers under the nose of a weak old man. I did not call a broker before the funeral was even over. I did not turn someone else's illness into a property opportunity. Arthur did not give me authority because I was pitiful. He gave it to me because I still understood the existence of a line. In that house, the rarest thing was not blood. It was moral discipline. In the end, I was the only one still holding on to it. I asked the lawyer what would happen if Matthew kept pushing. He opened Arthur's second sealed envelope in front of me. Inside was a short voice recording and an additional legal instruction sheet. Arthur's voice sounded rougher than usual, but was clear. He stated plainly that if Matthew pressured me to leave, tried to force a signature, tried to change the fund conditions, or used family conflict to undermine the residential rights, the larger share of his inheritance would be transferred into the supervised trust branch immediately. Then Arthur added a sentence that kept me sitting still for a long time after the recording ended. He said Matthew did not need everything. He only needed to feel that he had not lost. If he ever chose false pride over conscience, then money should never be given to him directly. That afternoon, I brought home copies of a few documents, not many, just enough that I was no longer standing in the dark. Matthew was already there. He stood in the kitchen, his phone face down on the table, his expression tight in the way of a man who has forced himself to stay calm too long. He asked where I had gone. I told him I had met the lawyer. He asked if there was anything new. I said yes and placed the file on the table. Matthew did not touch it at once. He looked at the cover first, then at me. The contempt I had seen in previous days was gone. What was there instead was fast calculation, as if he were measuring how soft I still might be. Then he shifted into blame. He said I had poisoned Arthur against him in the final months, that I had controlled the files, the medicine, and the appointments, and whispered things into Arthur's ear until his own father saw him as the enemy. I stood there listening, and the more he talked, the calmer I became. Because once the truth starts peeling back, men like Matthew always choose the same road. They do not examine their own conduct. They look for the obstacle. Yesterday, the obstacle had been the lawyer. Today, it was me. Tomorrow, it would have been Arthur's illness itself. Beneath every accusation sat the same need. He needed me to become the reason, so he would not have to look at himself. I asked him how many emails he had sent, pressuring his father to sign papers while he was weak. Matthew paused for one beat, then said, "Anyone caring for the elderly knew many things had to be handled early." I asked how many times he had tried to access the fund before his authority began. He changed direction instantly, saying lawyers always know how to make normal things look suspicious. Then I asked which investment had gone bad enough to make him need the inheritance that urgently. That was when he truly let his face show. Matthew slammed his hand down on the table hard enough to shake the glass. He said all of this was happening because Arthur and I were trying to push him out of his own family. Oddly, that made everything even clearer to me. In his head, people existed in only two roles. They either served him or they blocked his path. The longer he spoke, the farther he drifted from his polished mask. He said that if I had any decency, I should step aside for him. He said the house, the trust, and everything should flow through the bloodline, not toward someone who entered by marriage. Hearing the word bloodline no longer felt ridiculous. It only made Arthur sound even more accurate. Matthew did not see people. He saw the true value of assets. Anyone who helped the flow move toward him counted as family. Anyone who stood in the way, even after taking care of his father through every pill and every meal, became an outsider. That night, I did not keep arguing. I stacked the documents, locked them into my own drawer, and went upstairs. A few minutes later, Matthew came after me, stopped in the doorway, and said in a lower, uglier voice that I had no idea what I was playing with. I turned toward him and answered that, no, he was the one who did not understand. This was no longer about a dead man leaving money behind. This was about a father who knew exactly what his son would do the second he thought no one was looking. Matthew said nothing after that, but his face darkened in a way I had never seen since the day we married. I sat on the edge of the bed once the door shut and took out the small key Arthur had told me to keep hidden. It lay in my palm, light and cold. By then, I finally understood that Arthur had not left me a gift. He had left me the key that would allow me to look directly at the true scale of greed inside his own family.
Hello everyone, I'm Sophia, the person walking with you through these family stories. Before I go deeper into today's commentary, I want to invite you in with one short question. If you have ever seen someone treated like an outsider immediately after they were the one carrying the whole family, leave yes in the comments below. You just heard Nora's story. The coldest part of this story, to me, is not the will itself. It is not even the fact that Nora's name was read first. The coldest part is the moment right after the funeral ends. The guests have just left. The dead have not even had time to settle, and the living are already sorting people in their heads into two groups: family, and the person who needs to walk out the door. That one moment alone is enough to expose a person's moral core. A lot of viewers are going to hear the lawyer read Nora's name first and think that is the biggest twist. I do not. The biggest twist is Matthew's behavior in the first hours after the funeral, because the will does not create the tragedy. The will only shines light on one that was already there. Arthur did not turn his son into a greedy man after death. He simply arranged the situation so that greed would no longer have anywhere to hide. That is exactly why I think Matthew feels so real as a character. He is not the easy kind of villain. He does not need to shout from the beginning. He does not need a giant breakdown. He does not need anything theatrical. He only needs to believe that anything carrying his family name naturally belongs to him. His father's house is his. His father's money is his. The right to decide is his. The person who cared, maintained, carried, and held things together every day was only temporary labor. That kind of cruelty is painfully real. It does not need violence. It grants itself legitimacy through bloodline. That is also why I think many viewers will feel this story in a very specific place. Nora is not insulted in huge, obvious ways right from the start. She is erased through speed. While Arthur is alive, she is necessary. The second he dies, she is treated like a task that has already been completed. The deepest pain is not simply being told to leave a house. It is realizing that the man you married has been seeing you as family labor with an expiration date. Valuable while the burden remained. Disposable once the burden was over. That truth usually lands harder than money ever could. Now let's talk about Arthur. What I love here is that the story does not turn him into some ideal father-in-law. He is not gentle. He is not warm. He is not the kind of man who always knows the perfect thing to say. He is dry. He is hard. He keeps a distance. Yet that is exactly why his choice carries so much more weight. It does not come from late-life emotion. It comes from observation. He watched long enough to know who was keeping that house running through responsibility, and who was standing nearby waiting for it to become an available asset. The sharpest part is that Arthur does not handle this with moral speeches. He does not sit his son down and deliver one last ethical lesson. He does something much cleaner than that. He redesigns power inside the family. He uses law, timing, paperwork, conditions, evidence, and even his own son's personality to build a trap. If Matthew had been patient enough, if he had known how to stop, if he had behaved within limits, maybe he could still have kept some standing. But Arthur knew his son too well. He knew Matthew would get impatient. He knew he would believe he had won too soon. He knew he would walk straight into a trap built around money, image, and hunger. That is why the twist feels so satisfying while still staying believable. So why was Nora named in the will first? To me, that is the richest part of the whole story. Not because Arthur loved her more than his own son. Not because he wanted to repay her in some sentimental way. He did it because inside that house, Nora was the only person still acting by principle. In a lot of families, the person who keeps the daily rhythm alive is the one whose name gets spoken the least. The person who prepares medicine, keeps appointments straight, changes sheets, cleans up, and handles everything. They are so quiet that their labor starts looking like an obligation instead of an effort. Then things begin to wobble, and only then do people finally see who the real support beam was. I also want to pause on the image of the house itself. That home is not just real estate. It is memory. It is labor. It is Nora's care. The nights of changing water, the carefully prepared meals, the hospital trips, the folders, the medication schedules. Matthew sees the house as property. Nora lives inside it as a responsibility. Arthur has to die before everyone is forced to separate those two ways of seeing the same place. That is why Nora's staying does not feel satisfying because she gets a piece of the estate. It feels satisfying because invisible labor finally takes on a legal shape. The ending works because the story does not excuse greed. Matthew does not lose because he is unlucky. He does not lose because someone cheated him. He loses because his own moral reflexes are rotten in exactly the way Arthur predicted. That kind of ending hits hard. The wisest person in the room turns out to be the one already gone. The person who thinks he will win first is the very one who destroys himself. If this story touched something in you, don't forget to leave a comment, hit like, and subscribe so you can keep walking with me through stories like this. I'm Sophia. Thank you for staying all the way to the end. I'll see you in the next video. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel to stay in tune with further videos.